Welcome to everybody who's joined and is still joining to this month's May's Third Friday program. For those of you who have been with us before, you know that this is a project of the Big Bend Coalition Against Human Trafficking. This is our human trafficking, anti-human trafficking coalition here in North Florida. We're up in Florida's Panhandle region. So you know a little bit about BBCAT, which is our coalition. We meet quarterly. Our next meeting is coming up very soon, next week at 2 p.m. If you'd like to join us, please contact Kelly Doherty, and you can see her information there on the screen, as well as her email. And just so you know too, we're always looking for new members. Right now we are still meeting virtually. Hopefully we'll be meeting in person soon again, maybe the next meeting, depends. And we'll look forward to seeing all of you from the Big Bend area there, if so, as well as joining us next month. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, and we've got a question here from somebody, Chris, on where do we send email? And that's really your email on, if you're watching in a group, we need to make sure your names and emails go to centersupport@usf.edu. Did I get that right, Chris?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so just so we get everybody a certificate, USF sends that certificate out to you if you're watching in a group. If you've registered and it's just you, don't worry about it. We've got your email already and you're all set. So, all right, so this is a little bit about the organization that I am part of, the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center, or you'll hear me call it STAC. We're here to do two main things in the Big Bend area. We are here to assist all people who are trafficked, whether that person is labor or sex trafficked, a young, old, male, female, anyone and everyone who has been trafficked or who might be at risk of being trafficked. We do lots of prevention and as well as intervention work. We provide case management directly to survivors with a host of community partners here, ranging from housing providers to substance abuse, to direct aid, to survivors, and just you name it. We do a lot of work. We're doing a lot of outreach these days into our rural areas, really trying to address the misconception that human trafficking only happens in our urban areas. We know that it happens all over, and including our rural areas, which often go neglected. We do lots and lots of community education, as well as tailor education as well to specific agencies, organizations, or groups. I think last week, I'm booked to go to 2 Kiwanis clubs in June. So we're ready to go wherever and whenever you need somebody to talk about this issue. Okay, next slide, please. Some of the things I'd like to share with you include information about past training programs, and I'm going to put this right now into the chat because we always get asked, which is this program is being recorded. It will go up on our website at this link, and you can see the past 2 programs actually we've done with you, Martina, are up there as program 1 and 2 on labor trafficking, child labor trafficking, and labor law. So we really appreciate that. Right now, we've had this ongoing great partnership with you. So those are up there. This program will be added to that list in the next couple of weeks. So know that that's there. We've got lots of other materials for you, including posters and other information for healthcare settings. Go to our website, which you see there, surviveandthriveadvocacy.org, and know that all of our services and support are free of charge. The recording will get uploaded within the next couple of weeks or so. It's as soon as we get it, we put it up there, so you can check it out then. And I know it's going to be great. You're going to want to share it with everybody you know. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. One of our latest efforts, and I really encourage everyone to take a look at this, is stacpro.org. We were funded by our local county commission here to develop this training for businesses. And when I say businesses, I really mean all workplaces, whether it's for-profits, nonprofits, anyone who's in a workspace know that you are eyes and ears that could be there to help someone who's been trafficked. We know that, you know, as far as this goes, whether someone's coming to a convenience store, someone might be trafficked and might be in a retail setting, someone might be being groomed by a trafficker. So you might be at a salon or a clothing store. You might see someone purchasing things like, you know, multiple burner phones, for example. Anyway, we've got training in this program that's for anyone really in any business setting, hotels, any of hospitality, financial sector, banks, even office parks. I know here in Tallahassee, we're our state's capital, so we've got lots and lots of offices. You need to be aware too, whether you're looking at someone who might be doing any work in and around your workspace, both as skilled and unskilled labor. So go to stackpro.org. It's free. It takes about an hour. You can do it at your leisure in chunks of time. So next slide, please. All right. Today, I want to just say thank you so much to our amazing presenters who are with us, and also to our sponsors. So know that, again, program of the Big Bend Coalition Against Human Trafficking, our legal services sponsor, Legal Services of North Florida. Thank you very much to you for also obtaining the CLE, Continuing Legal Education credit. We'll have 2 credit hours that of the intermediate level for all of us who need, all of us lawyers who need CLE credit to maintain our law license. You'll be able to do that. And also let me tell you, if any of you are out of state watching this and need CLE, if you need anything from your local bar, if you need, you know, bios, or if you need an outline of today's presentation, whatever it is, just let me know if there's anything I can do to help facilitate you getting your CLE credit. Of course, our partner, the International Rescue Committee, we do this work hand in hand with you. And again, this is a project, really a labor of love and dedication from our agency, the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center. So today, let me get through now the rest of our sort of introductions so that we can get to what a wonderful panel this will be. First, let me tell you, this is a, and listen, I have to tell both you, Jose and Martina, if this happens again, let's do it. And that is, the last time we spoke, we didn't have enough time to talk about restitution. And Martina graciously said, well, let's do a program on restitution. So if we organically have this idea, please, everybody who's watching, and Martina and Jose, if there is anything you think we need to do next, we're open, as you can tell. So this program really grew out of our last session we did on trafficking, child labor trafficking. And so I can't thank you all enough, and also Jose in particular, to start off and welcome you to our Third Friday programs, and thank you. And let me tell you all a little bit about Jose. Jose Luis Alfaro is a lived experience expert on domestic child sex trafficking. He's a public speaker, an author, an advocate, and an activist. He's worked with several anti-human trafficking organizations worldwide to spread awareness on trafficking, specifically within the LGBTQ+ community. Jose currently is working on a memoir depicting his personal experience with trafficking. He's been featured in several publications, excuse me, and has worked with law enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice. His work includes public speaking and giving lectures, sharing his story and statistics on human trafficking. And in 2021, he authored, quote, "I'm a survivor of sex trafficking and invisible no more," which is a powerful opinion piece featured in the Boston Globe. Now, I want you also to know that on our website, that piece is available for you, and it's not behind a firewall, a paywall, what am I saying? A paywall, and you can read it, and I highly encourage you to do that after this program. In December 2022, Alfaro presented, must be December 2021, sorry, presented at a Survivor Leadership Series session titled A Survivor's Guide to Criminal and Civil Cases. So Jose, welcome so much to our program today. I'd like to also introduce a colleague and friend, Martina Vandenberg. Martina is the founder and president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, which she established in 2012, actually. Happy 10th birthday. Martina is an accomplished attorney. She spent 2 decades fighting human trafficking, forced labor, rape as a war crime, and violence against women. She's represented victims of human trafficking pro bono in immigration, criminal, and civil cases, and has testified before Congress and an array of other bodies, national and international, on an array of human rights issues. Through the Human Trafficking Legal Center, she's trained more than 3,600 pro bono attorneys nationwide to handle human trafficking matters. I'll be moderating our program today, and I'm so honored to be with you both. Let me turn it over right now to Jose and Martina.
My job here is really just to set the stage for Jose's powerful testimony about what it is to get restitution in the US federal courts. So I'm going to do a very short introduction, and then I'm going to hand off to Jose to talk about the real lived experience of trying to get restitution in the United States in the federal courts, trying to collect it, and trying to get any form of compensation after being trafficked. So next slide, please. So I'm going to cover the definitions, because what I have found, and I think what Jose has found too, is that when you enter the world of criminal justice, you enter an entirely new dictionary. And so my job here is to be the dictionary. We're going to cover just a few terms very quickly: restitution, forfeiture, restoration, remission, and civil damages. Next slide, please. So let me start with restitution. When there's a criminal case at the federal level, restitution, which is a kind of compensation for victims, is mandatory. It is mandatory under 18 U.S.C. 1593, which is the statute if you want to look it up. The statute's very short and very clear. So next slide. The statute basically says that a victim in a human trafficking case must receive compensation through the criminal restitution process that covers the full amount of that victim's losses. Then Congress went on to define, so how do you calculate those losses? In a forced labor case, it's pretty easy. You figure out how many hours the person worked. The Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division will do the math. They'll create an enormous spreadsheet of back wages that are owed. They'll multiply it by 2 to get liquidated damages under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So under forced labor, a criminal prosecution for forced labor, restitution at the time of sentencing is pretty straightforward. Sex trafficking cases are trickier. Mandatory restitution in the sex trafficking context means that prosecutors and survivors are calculating the value to the defendant of the victim services. So just to put this in concrete terms, if a trafficker charges $500 for a sexual service from a child every day, then in the criminal restitution context, that child is getting the $500. And this part of restitution, I call this part 1, this can be very back of the envelope. We've seen cases in child sex trafficking cases where a child had a quota of $1,000 a day or $500 a day. The prosecutors literally take that quota, they multiply it by the number of days the child was held, and then they come out with a total. And that is the total for restitution for the gross income to the defendant for the victim services. So that's part 1, but let's talk about part 2. Part 2 is next. Next slide, please. There's also a piece that's not quite so back of the envelope. There's a piece where you actually need receipts. So if you're a victim of trafficking and you are fighting to get restitution, and the prosecutors are filing to get restitution for you, as they are required by law to do, that restitution request also should have concrete expenses for costs you have already incurred, things like medical services, psychological services, all of that. For anything that's backwards looking, you need receipts. You can also add in backwards looking with receipts, physical and occupational therapy, transportation, housing, childcare, lost income, etc. Okay, that's the backwards looking piece. But the innovation in federal restitution is that we can also do forward looking. And so we have had experts come into these federal criminal human trafficking cases and say, both in the sex trafficking and in the labor trafficking context, they have said, as part of part 2 of the mandatory restitution calculation, this person will need therapy for the rest of their lives. I'm an expert, and I'm going to estimate that therapy for the rest of this person's life will cost $1 million. That forward-looking piece of the restitution for future services that are proximately caused, that are required because of the harm that the trafficker committed, those future-looking services can also be wrapped into the actual accounting of the victim's losses. So in one case, for example, US versus Lewis, there were 4 child victims of sex trafficking. It was a case here in the District of Columbia. For those 4 children, the restitution order was $3.8 million. That included both Part A, how much they had earned for that defendant while he held them in forced prostitution. And then it also included Part B, how much it was cost for them to recover in the future. And then also any receipts that they have had. The problem that we have with trafficking is that victims very rarely have receipts, right? People just don't save receipts when they're in the middle of a trafficking situation. It's a little difficult. Okay, next slide, please. Unfortunately, what we have found in our own research is that prosecutors very rarely request restitution. Courts very rarely actually order restitution. And so it is incumbent upon all of us to make sure that federal courts are following the law and that trafficking survivors are getting restitution. Next slide, please. Okay, what happens though when the government forfeits all of the defendant's assets? So the government goes in and as part of the criminal case, they say you used this house as part of the crime scene. And so we're seizing the house, and then the government sells the house and they get all the proceeds. And then there's nothing left. And so what do? There is a program that is run through the Department of Justice to return forfeited assets to trafficking survivors and other victims of crime. Next slide, please. There are 2 ways to do this. One way is restoration. So restoration, this is a lot of R's, but restoration is the process that prosecutors use when there is a restitution order. And so prosecutors are required under trafficking law to put in a request to the Department of Justice saying, US government, you forfeited this money from this defendant. The Treasury currently has that money, but that money is owed to the victim to pay a restitution order. And so it should be, in theory, a seamless process where the government forfeits the assets and then the assets are turned around and provided to the trafficking victim to cover the restitution order. That's the way it should go. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. And Jose is going to tell you about how things can go badly wrong. The other option is when the government fails to request restitution or when the court fails to order restitution, there could be assets that were forfeited, a trafficker's $100,000 that he had in his bank account, but the victims have no restitution order. And so they have no right to that money. What victims can do is file something called a petition for remission. The petition for remission is essentially a petition to the government saying, you have that trafficker's money, but that trafficker's money is actually my money and it's owed to me because I have suffered severe losses because of what was done to me. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this because I want to get to Jose's presentation, but I have put at the bottom of this slide, and you will get the slides, I have put at the bottom of this slide the link to the little guide that the Department of Justice has put out on restoration and remission so that you can have a sense of how these petitions can be filed. And the good news is that people do recover money. People do get money that has been forfeited. They do get it back. Next slide, please. Okay, the last thing I'm going to say, this is the very tail end. We've talked about the criminal process. We've talked about restitution. We've talked about restoration to try and get forfeited assets. We've talked about remission to try and get forfeited assets where there's no restitution order. The other option that trafficking survivors have is filing lawsuits. And so as a lawyer, one of the things that I do is train other lawyers and also file these cases myself, but file cases on behalf of trafficking survivors against traffickers or those who financially benefit for civil damages. Now, civil damages are very different than criminal restitution. Two separate cases, sometimes two separate judges, often two separate legal teams. Nevertheless, a trafficking survivor, whether or not there's a criminal case, has the right to bring a civil case in the federal court under a law, 18 U.S.C. 1595. Next slide, please. And just to give you a hint of how these cases can go, this is a case that was brought by a trafficking survivor who was an American citizen held in forced labor as part of a cult. She was held for more than 10 years and held in forced labor as a child. That case went to a federal court in Kansas City, and the judge awarded that victim $8 million in damages. So those damages come directly from the defendant, and they have to be collected by the lawyers who brought the case. So it's a little bit complicated. In a case of restitution, it's the federal prosecutors who are collecting the money. In the case of civil damages, it's civil lawyers trying to collect the damages. So that's my last slide. That, I think, sets the stage for the remarks that Jose is going to make. And it gives you a sense of the kinds of terms and the kinds of procedures and legal processes that we are using. And I have to say, Jose has mastered them. And Jose basically plays a lawyer on TV now. So Jose, over to you. Thanks.
First and foremost, thank you so much for having me here today, and thanks for being here. The restitution process was so difficult, and even just hearing Martina's slides, you kind of already know that it's just a completely different language if you haven't studied it. And so for me, going through this process, it just was so difficult, and it was so foreign to me. And so without the proper systems to help survivors navigate restitution, but even just the criminal part of it is just, it's really, really, really tough. And so I'm hoping that I can give you a little bit of insight on how this was from my perspective. And so I want to start with a little bit of the case background. And I'm going to start right after escaping and leaving Jason Gandy, my trafficker. And I was kind of just left with a lot of mental health issues, from PTSD, anxiety, depression, and really just not knowing that that's what I was even going through. So I'm going through all of this, but also I'm trying to live a normal life. I'm trying to work. I'm trying to go to school. I'm trying to do all of the things that I wanted to do before this happened to me. And I wasn't able to do that because of the traumas or what I was experiencing because of my traumas. And so I tried to work, I tried to go to school, but I just couldn't do it anymore. And so I started to blame myself for everything that happened to me because I didn't identify as a trafficking survivor. I didn't know what happened to me, and I didn't know that it wasn't my fault. And so I started using alcohol and drugs to cope. And I had gone to jail several times where I was acting out. And also I had been arrested for possession of marijuana in the state of Texas. And so the list just goes on of all of the aftermath and what I was experiencing and how I was acting out afterward. And so I went 7 years until I was able to actually put a title to what happened to me. So in 2014, I had already moved to Boston, Massachusetts. I began a career for myself, a successful career. And I met my current partner, whom I've been with for 10 years now. And I was ready to move on with my life. I was ready to start fresh, and head in the direction that I was heading. Because for once in my life, I had a career and I was supporting myself the way that I wanted to 7 years prior. And then I had a friend come and visit me from Houston, Texas. And he says, Jose, I know what happened to you when you were a teenager, and you have to check out this article that was put out just a few weeks ago. And basically, this article explained that Gandhi had been arrested in London attempting to sex traffic a boy at the London Olympics. And I remember reading this article and just feeling fearful, afraid that if I share what had happened to me, that I was going to go to prison for, and I want to put this in parentheses, for participating, because this is what my trafficker did to silence me, to keep me from ever going forward and sharing with anyone what happened to me. And so I contemplated not calling. Eventually I did. I contacted the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That was the number that was provided at the end of the article. They then put me in touch with Homeland Security here in Boston, Massachusetts, who then Skyped with the US Attorney's Office, the prosecutors working on the case against Gandhi. And I just want to share mentally what I was going through at that moment. I was still terrified of going to prison. I thought that if I shared everything that happened, that afterward they were just going to put me in handcuffs and take me away. And for a long time, I felt this way through the entire legal process. But I shared, I did what I could. I felt like I wanted to help as much as possible. And I told myself I just had to be transparent and share everything that happened. Mind you, I'm also trying to remember every single detail. And I didn't have a lot of time. It was about a week that I met up with Homeland Security, and I was in their office where I'm sharing everything that happened. And as I'm talking, bits and pieces are coming to me, but not all of it I had really never really thought about. And so shortly after that, we then begin the process of discovery, and they're asking me for evidence and asking me for receipts and asking me for all of this different stuff. But also I'm trying to understand what a DA is, what a prosecutor is, what this is going to look like moving forward. How am I going to navigate this? I don't even understand what they're saying to me. So I'm Googling, I'm trying to figure it out on my own. And eventually I'm like, screw this. I have so much going on in my life. I'm trying to focus on my career, something that I built for myself, and I don't want to ruin that. And then I'm also, dealing with my relationship. I want to make sure that we're healthy and that we're good, but I'm also trying to survive in life, right? After everything that I've gone through, suddenly all of the effects of my traumas have hit me all over again. And the only thing that I know to do is to go to the bar and order a tequila drink. And so that's basically what I knew best. And I started that path all over again. And I basically shut off my phone and I'm like, I don't want to talk about this anymore. And I want no part in this. And so just navigating the system at the very beginning is just incredibly tough when you're still trying to survive in life. And then now you have to figure out a whole new system and a whole new language. It feels impossible. And so shortly after that, I think about 4 years went on where this entire process was going on until we were finally told we were going to go to trial. So from 2014 to 2018, I'm struggling and I'm trying to figure out, is this ever going to happen? If it does, what's going to come of it and when? And so 2018, we finally go to trial. I had not really been fully prepped to testify. I never really was given a tour of the courtroom. I really didn't know what it was going to feel like having a jury there. I didn't know how many people were going to be present. And I just didn't know really what to expect. And because I didn't know what to expect, I was terrified. And literally last minute, I remember sitting on a bench outside of the courtroom right before I was going to testify. And I was thinking, just back out. You don't have to do this. It just felt incredibly scary. And I remember my legs are just shaking uncontrollably. And I'm like, where do I go? Where do I walk to? What do I say? Do I raise my right, my left hand? what am I supposed to do in this process? And I just kind of had to figure it out. And I remember going up there, beginning the testimony. But when you're in front of so many people and you're sharing your experience, you begin to forget even just your date of birth and your name. And so I sat there just terrified, emotional, and I'm kind of answering the questions to the best of my knowledge, asking them to repeat them over and over again, because mentally there were so many pieces to my story that I didn't know at what parts they were talking about. And so had I had been properly prepared, I think that this process would have been a little bit easier for me. But also, if I had had maybe even an attorney to help me navigate this process and have a better understanding, it would have helped tremendously. But I also thought that the US attorneys were my attorneys. And I think that many survivors think that this is the case. And so through the entire process, I thought the US Attorney's Office is going to have my back. They're going to do anything and everything that I need to make sure that I'm well equipped for this process. And that wasn't so much the case. I then, after testifying, I finally got to meet the other survivors in this case. And for once, I got to, you know, feel validated in meeting others who had been through something so similar. But this was a moment where the victims coordinator sat us down and told us that we would begin a process called restitution. And restitution for me just sounded like an outlandish word, something I'd never heard of. And so the victims coordinator explained what restitution is. And I know that we've already have gotten the actual definition of restitution, but the definition that I was given was it was money that the victims in this case were entitled to after testifying that would then make them whole again. And I put that in quotations because an amount of money that would make someone whole again is not possible. There is no amount that would ever make me whole again. And I remember just feeling like, is there even money? Would we ever even collect any money? How long is this process going to be? I don't really understand this. But the victims coordinator handed us some forms and kind of left it up to us to figure it out. And so after the case, eventually we get a guilty verdict. Gandhi was sentenced to 30 years in prison with no chance of parole. And you would think that suddenly your life is rainbows and butterflies, but that wasn't the case. Now I'm dealing with the aftermath of reliving all of my traumas all over again in front of so many people. And not only this, it's also in news reports. My family knows about it. Everyone around me knows about it. And now I've got to learn how to live the life that I've been living, but also add all of my traumas on top of it. And so this is where I thought restitution was going to help me. And I thought, well, hopefully this will come quicker than later because I need this ASAP. Because suddenly now I need to miss work. I can't do the things that I was able to do before. I needed to take some time off for my mental health. Things were going terribly in my relationship, mostly because I was lashing out, because I was reliving a lot of those traumas and blaming my partner who had nothing to do with it. I was blaming him for what I had gone through. And it would have been so important that I had a therapist, that I had a victims advocate that was really advocating for me and helping me through this entire process. But also, it would have been helpful to have the restitution to help me pay for a lot of those services that I needed at that time. And so, after receiving the restitution forms, I sat with them. And I sat with them for a while, trying to understand how I was going to provide receipts that were going to prove that I needed the therapy, that I needed the help that I needed moving forward. And it kind of occurred to me in a way that it's like, I just testified in front of a judge. he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and I now still have to show proof that I need therapy after explaining all of the trauma that I have just experienced. And it just didn't make sense to me. Better yet, like Martina said, no one's walking around with receipts and waiting for the moment that they have to prove that what happened to them and the services that they need. And so I began trying to figure it out on my own with zero instructions. And I come up with a number of $5,000. And to be honest with you, I was afraid that if I submitted a number too large, that they were going to think that I was money hungry and that I was just trying to take money from Gandhi. But in reality, what I didn't know is that this money was truly something that I really needed. I needed to be able to move forward with my life, and I needed to pay for services that were going to cost me a ton of money. So I contact the victims coordinator. I'm in tears, I'm crying. And she gives me a few more tips on how to fill out the form. And she tells me, think outside of the box. And I'm trying, I'm thinking, and eventually I come up with a number of $25,000. And even then, I thought that that was a large number, but looking back now, that's not even nearly enough to help me with the lifelong traumas that I'm going to be dealing with. So I submitted that form with $25,000, and I assumed that the victims coordinator was going to look at it and say, Jose, you can claim so much more money on this form. Let's take a look at it. Let's work together and let's put a larger number on the form. But instead, the form was submitted, and then I heard nothing. And so I didn't want to call and pressure them, mostly because I was fearful that I would be bothering them. And so I waited about half a year. And I contacted them and I said, look, like I haven't received anything. How long is this process supposed to take? When will I see a check? And I was told, almost in shock, that I hadn't received any form of payment. And I was told that they were going to look into it. And then eventually I was told that I should receive the money by Christmas. And I don't know about you, but every holiday I'm thinking of all the gifts that I could buy for family and for loved ones, all of the things that I can do for the people that I love in my life. And suddenly I'm thinking I'm going to get a check for $25,000 or hopefully more if the victims coordinator added more money to my form. And I'm just thinking this is going to be a great holiday. And so I waited and I waited, nothing came. And it was mid-July when I contacted the victims coordinator again. And I said, hey, just letting you know, I haven't received a check. And then I am told, oh no, this is terrible. Let me look into it. And eventually they get back to me and tell me that they made a few mistakes, but that they were going to take care of it, that this was uncharted territory, and they were still trying to figure out how this process works. But unfortunately, they're going to make things right and they'll figure it out. So a few months goes by. I'm again told that near Christmas, around Thanksgiving, I would finally be receiving restitution. And I want to mention these 2 years, I was struggling. I was struggling immensely. And not only that, in 2019 or 2020, we're all going through a global pandemic. And I have no job. I have, really no support. And I'm relying on unemployment at some point. But I went several months where I didn't have a paycheck and I didn't have any money. And thank God for having my partner who was able to support me. But I was really relying on that restitution check to help me at that time. And I just didn't know when or if I would ever get it. And when I was told that I would receive it in December, I really didn't hold my breath because I already knew that I was told that already and it never happened. And so eventually it's getting close to Christmas and I'm finally told that it's definitely going to happen. I'm going to receive my check. But I get a call from the victims coordinator and she says, Jose, I want to let you know that there is a whole new process that we're going to be starting, and you're going to receive even more money than the $25,000 that you're going to be collecting in restitution. And I actually wasn't excited. I was upset because the biggest question that I had was, why now? Why are we now going and doing a separate process when the first process hasn't even happened and I haven't received the restitution when I was supposed to receive it 2 years ago? And I was then told that I that this would be an opportunity to claw back more money because there were so many mistakes that had already been made, and that they wanted to make things right for me. And then they told me that this would also be an opportunity for the others to collect more money in this process. So then I start thinking, what happened to the other survivors and why did they not submit a restitution form? And I asked the question to the victims coordinator, and she says, oh, a few of them just didn't want any of his money. They wanted nothing to do with the restitution process, and they were ready to move on with their lives. And a part of me understood that, but also a part of me didn't, because I don't think that if that was their decision, I don't think that they fully understood what this money was for and what it could actually do for them. And so I started thinking about it more and more. And the more I thought about it, the more upset that I got. And I'm so happy that I was connected to Martina and the Human Trafficking Legal Center, because navigating through the system for as long as I had alone was so tough. But being connected with a lawyer at that time was so crucial in helping us claim more money, and doing it in a way that making sure that we receive as much as possible. So I ask a second question. And the second question is, if the other victims are not going to claim restitution, and I'm collecting $25,000, and I just Googled the property and the property that you auctioned off, and you received $250,000, what happens to the other $225,000 that you have now seized in assets? And the victims coordinator kind of stumbled, and she said, well, that goes into a fund. And I said, well, what is the fund? And she said, well, it funds law enforcement officers for office tools, police cars, anything that they need. And I said, well, that doesn't sound right to me. It sounds like that belongs to myself and to the other victims in this case. And so I kind of sat there just feeling like I have just been taken advantage of. I've been used to testify in this case, and I'm going to be left with no help, no resources, and no one to help me moving forward. And I have just spent 2 years of my life trying to figure out how to get this money. And so that is when Martina and her team stepped in, and they connected me with lawyers to help me navigate this now new process called the remission process. Now, after getting Martina involved, and really trying to connect and figure out where this money is and why the government has been sitting on this money for almost 3 years at this point, Martina and her team finally eventually pressured them and said, we need to get Jose the restitution money, and then we can begin this remission process, but he needs to be paid the restitution money first. And I'm so happy that I had someone advocating for me, because I would not have had the courage to say that, feeling like this is just how the process is supposed to go and I have to go along with it. And eventually, I was finally given a restitution check for the $25,000. And now we were waiting to receive the remission. And at this point, now I'm thinking, maybe it's best that I contact the other survivors in this case and just ask if they've been contacted by the victims coordinator to see if they were going to be participating in the remission process. And to my somewhat surprise, I contacted the first survivor, and he says, I had no clue that any of this was going on. I thought that we were still going to be collecting restitution. And I say to him, I think that you've already missed the deadline and that process, but this process will give you the opportunity to claim the money that you need. And I said, from experience, this process is not easy. And I think it's best that you connect with the Human Trafficking Legal Center, and they can hopefully connect you with a pro bono lawyer that will help you through this process. And I have to say, they were so thankful and they were so happy that I connected them, because they had absolutely no clue what the restitution process was. And they actually thought that they had already submitted forms for restitution. They just thought that maybe there was no money to collect. And so they had basically just given up. And I'm so happy that I connected with them and talked to them about it, because shortly after, I was contacted by one of the survivors, just sharing with me the struggles that he was going through, where he wasn't able to eat and basically provide with himself basic needs. And I took it upon myself to send him as much money as he needed during this time, because I know what that's like. I know what it's like to go on and not be able to provide for yourself, which then leads you right back into a life where you're then having to possibly end up in a re-exploitative situation. And I didn't want that for him. And so we then begin this restitution process, and I am talking with the survivors on a weekly basis, and they are explaining to me the frustrations that they're having, just like I did. And they don't understand it, and they don't understand why it's taking so long, when the victims coordinator told them that this would be a quick process. And so they're planning, they took out loans, they're planning their future, they're planning their lives. And without this restitution coming as quickly as possible, then now they're left with more bills that they're not able to pay. And this process probably took another, I would say, year until any of us were able to see any of the money from the remission process. I feel as though like there were so many steps that could have been taken, and so many areas that were missed that could have happened, and all of this could have been avoided altogether. And I think that it's so important that I just reiterate the importance of having a pro bono lawyer help any survivor in this case, but also having a therapist and someone talking with each survivor and helping them, because it is exhausting. It is scary. You don't know if you're going to wake up the next morning and just feel like you can't go on with life. There were many times where, even during the trial, where I contemplated suicide and I thought that I couldn't go on with my life. And I couldn't imagine going through the case and then a survivor committing suicide because it was too much for them to handle, when this should be a time where survivors feel like they've won, like they've succeeded. And instead, it was a time where we felt like this was too hard for us to handle, and there's no way that we can move forward. And it shouldn't be that way. We should feel empowered. We should feel excited to move forward with our life. And we should feel entitled to the money that we are owed, and not feel as though that we are a burden and that we're going to be viewed as money hungry. And when at the end of the day, we are just trying to survive and trying to move on with our lives. And I think that that is just the importance of what restitution is we need restitution to really move forward, and not fully and not wholly, but just to give us a little something to go on. And whether that means take a month off from work because we want to focus on our mental health, or that means go on a vacation because we've never been able to go on a vacation because we've been working our entire lives to survive, or that means I just need to pay rent. And if this is going to help me live my life and to survive, then I'm thankful for it. But I just think that this entire process is so complicated and so tough, and it shouldn't be this way. It should be simpler. It should be a given at the end of the day. I shouldn't have to provide receipts. I shouldn't have to prove that what happened to me and this is why I need services. It should be just a given. Um, and then shortly after that, I was able to pursue a civil suit against Gandhi. Um, and with the help of the Human Trafficking Legal Center, I was again connected with a pro bono lawyer who helped me through this process. I do want to say that both of these cases were going on at the same time. So that also kind of made it a little more complicated for me, just trying to navigate and understand who to talk to, who not to talk to, what's expected throughout the entire case. But the civil case was a little different and it was a little easier. And I want to say it was probably easier because I did have a lawyer helping me with all of it. I wasn't expected to write down all of my expenses. I didn't have to write down, the missed work, what I had gone through. It was all taken care of for me with a team of professionals. And so when I went in to testify, there was no jury present. Gandhi was not there. It was just me, my attorney, Gandhi's attorney, and a judge, and then someone basically taking notes. And I sat there, I shared my experience, I shared my story with the assumption that there was no more property to be seized. There was nothing, no money. I just went in thinking like, this is gonna give me validation, and this is going to make Gandhi owe me for the rest of my life and ultimately give me my power back. And that was more than enough for me. And so we went in and planned to sue Gandhi for $450,000. That's a number that the attorneys come up with, not me. And I'm sitting in front of a judge who is white collar, male, straight, cis, and I'm thinking like, this guy's gonna look at me, he's gonna know I'm gay, I'm Latino, I grew up in Texas, I know people's biases against people like me, and he's probably not going to grant me this money. And to my surprise, the judge came back with a verdict of 1.43 million. And it was just a moment of excitement. But it felt like not only a win for me, but a win for the community, for the movement, and a way to just say that there are people who are good people and that are looking out for you and really want to make sure that justice is served. And it really meant the world to me when that happened. And after that process, after having that verdict, that wasn't the end. There's a whole new area that I had to kind of navigate again, but I still had the help of attorneys. And through navigating this process, I then had to kind of start pushing the attorneys to move a little quicker and also doing the work myself. And if I could give to any advice to anyone that's pursuing a civil suit against their trafficker or their abuser, it's to start investigating yourself, because this is going to help expedite the process. And so I started to investigate, and I began going through all of the social media that Gandhi had, searching for an address or a possible piece of property that he might have owned previously. And to my surprise, I found property in Dallas. I shared the address and all of the information with my attorneys, and then they then began the process to basically seize those assets and again auction them off which then that money would go towards my civil judgment. And I do want to mention, having a civil judgment of 1.43 million, I assumed that maybe the money from the restitution in the criminal case, because I was only collecting $25,000, I assumed maybe the rest of that money would go towards my civil judgment. But because they are two separate cases, that's not how it worked. And that was really disappointing to hear. But I was also happy to hear that there was other property that we could seize and have go towards my civil judgment. But like I said, a lot of these processes are just so difficult. They feel like they're never ending. But I am so thankful for the people that have been advocating and have been pushing and making sure that all and every victim that is having to testify and work in these cases has the proper support moving forward. And so I couldn't thank the Human Trafficking Legal Center. I couldn't thank the pro bono attorneys as much as I needed, because it's really been life-changing. Although it's been a lot of work, it's been really life-changing for me to be able to claim my power back and say, you know, I did this, and I'm now able to move forward with my life and hopefully empower others to do the same. I think
So
that
Jose, there are questions for you, and this is remarkable. You haven't been following the chat. I've been following the chat for you, and everyone is just so grateful to you for sharing this experience and sharing the wisdom that you have learned. One question that came in was, would a guardian ad litem have been helpful for you if you had had a guardian ad litem or some?
I'm a little confused on what.
So usually guardian ad litems are for children, where the court will assign someone. So maybe you were already an adult when the case went to trial. Is that right?
Yeah.
The criminal case? Okay. So would it have been helpful, for example, if the court had assigned a pro bono attorney for you or some sort of advocate for you?
Oh my gosh, 100%. I think that all of us were just navigating blind, like we were lost completely through the entire process. And it would have been incredibly helpful. And looking back now, it's crucial. And I think that it's important that anyone testifying in a criminal case against their abuser has some form of victim advocate or has a pro bono attorney to help them to navigate, because it would be life-changing.
So Jose, another question that's come in is how did you get connected to the Human Trafficking Legal Center?
I was actually connected. It's one of my favorite stories, actually. I was sharing my story with Polaris. They asked me just to share my experience with them, and they wanted to, share it on their platform. And I agreed 100%. And as I'm getting to the legal process and the restitution, Laura Powers from Polaris says, Jose, some of this just doesn't sound like it's going correct. And she goes, and I'm shocked that it's been over a year or two and you haven't received restitution. She goes, I think it's important that you just get advice from an attorney that I know in DC and just kind of see if everything's going the way it's supposed to. And so I was connected to Martina Vandenberg from the Human Trafficking Legal Center. And I remember the email that I sent to her. It was just explaining everything that had happened and that had occurred and how frustrated I was and how upset I was. I felt like I was like almost being taken advantage of, and I was scared in a way. And Martina really looked into it and helped me. But I was connected from Polaris, but I also found out that while the criminal case was going on and I started my civil case, Martina and the Human Trafficking Legal Center had already been involved, and they were the ones that connected me to my pro bono lawyers at that time. And I remember Martina and I had a really beautiful moment where we were just so emotional. And I was so emotional because I felt for so long I didn't have anyone looking out for me, right? Because my parents had already disowned me. They wanted nothing to do with me. And so I didn't really have the support system that I needed. And just to hear that there were people looking out for me behind the scenes, it meant the world to me. And Martina, so graciously, she says, we were just a bridge. It's no big deal. And I'm like, no, you are a bridge that, changed my life for forever. So as small as you think that the work that you're doing for any survivor, it's actually could make the biggest difference and change in their life.
Yeah, I love that call, Jose, because we were both bawling on that call because we had been working behind the scenes on Jose's case for a couple of years before I ever got to meet Jose. One other question that has come in is, it's actually directed at me, this one, Jose. Does the Human Trafficking Legal Center assist minors, or would that only happen if they had parents with them? The answer is it depends. And we handle minor cases, but most of the cases that we're handling currently involving minors, where we've assigned those cases to pro bono lawyers, are cases of American citizens who've gone abroad to sexually abuse children. So when those Americans are extradited back to the United States, the children are still in the country where the abuse occurred, and the children need US lawyers to represent them in the criminal case here in the United States, in order to make sure that the children in the Philippines or in the Vietnam or in Thailand or wherever those children may be, Moldova, to make sure that those children get restitution as well. The other piece of this, and Jose, it wasn't such an issue for you because you were an adult and competent and totally financially aware, but and totally on top of all of this, even doing your own financial investigations. For children, getting a restitution order can be extremely problematic. And so one of the other reasons that you want to have pro bono counsel is so that the pro bono lawyers can set up a trust. Because one of the worst restitution cases I ever saw was a case where I actually thought it was fabulous. The child had gotten more than $100,000 in restitution. It had been collected. Everything seemed wonderful until I read that child's, now an adult, her autobiography. She was told that her foster family could adopt her, and if they adopted her, she would become a US citizen more quickly. And her dream was to become a US citizen because she wanted to become an ICE agent, because that was the person who had pulled her out of her situation of forced labor. Her foster parents adopted her, at which point there was no trust set up. So her foster parents had complete access to all of the restitution, which they then promptly spent. And so when we're thinking about restitution, we always need to be thinking about 7 steps ahead. We need to be thinking about taxes. We need to be thinking about trust funds so that the money is safe until children reach the age of majority. So that's a long answer to a short question. We do, in some cases, place child victims of trafficking with pro bono lawyers here in the United States. But we're very careful about doing so because of the, just the inherent risks. And children also can't contract. So in some cases, the children's parents have to actually sign the engagement letter with the pro bono counsel. Jose, you've learned so much, and I know that now you're training prosecutors on how to do this better. And you mentioned that there were a lot of mistakes made along the way. So if you had a message to prosecutors, and there may even be some on this call, if you had a message to prosecutors, what would you tell them to do differently?
Well, there's a number of things, but I think it's just really important to make sure that the survivor is equipped and ready for testimony. I think that it goes beyond just sharing an experience. There's the aftermath of sharing your experience, which you then enter this dark place all over again and you're reliving your trauma. And you might think that you're going to be fine and you're going to be okay, but at the end of it, it's not fine and it's not okay. And it's extremely tough to even know what you're experiencing and the type of help that you need moving forward. And so I think that it's critical that prosecutors connect victims and survivors with the proper systems and support systems during and after. And that goes from therapy to a pro bono lawyer to a victim's advocate. There needs to be a team of people that are behind survivors when they're testifying and preparing to testify.
I mean, one thing that you said to me once, Jose, was that when you got that paperwork for the restitution from the victim witness coordinator at the U.S. Attorney's Office, they handed you the paperwork and you were completely paralyzed and frozen and didn't know what to do with it. And so I think, you know, your point that people need pro bono lawyers, it just is so much easier if a pro bono attorney is actually filling out that paperwork and using experts to do it. So then the numbers are much, much higher than 5,000. And you're not sort of scrambling around trying to find non-existent receipts. So there's a question for both of us, Jose. It's, what's the best way to find out if a trafficker has assets? Is there an initial inquiry? Many traffickers don't have assets and are effectively judgment proof. I recognize the empowerment of getting a judgment or a restitution order, but I wonder about the practical issue of collecting. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, your own experience trying to track down money is indicative of how this can work.
Absolutely. So initially, I contacted the victim's coordinator from the U.S. Attorney's Office. And even though this was regarding the civil case, I still just wanted to know if they had any insight of any of his property or assets. And I thought that this would be easily accessed. And unfortunately, I was told that she couldn't share any of that information with me because she wasn't an attorney herself. But I believe that she could have easily have connected me with the prosecutors in the case, who then could have shared with me what assets he owned and what property was available. But instead, I went on my own investigations and found addresses to properties that he owned. I then went to the Dallas appraisal website, looked up if these properties still exist and who the current owner was. And then I sent all of that information to the pro bono lawyers, who then checked them all off. And then I mentioned other areas where they could look to see if there's any other property. And they were like, at some point he did own other property, but he sold them. But I had so many questions, like, are there bank accounts? Where can we look? Where can we find this money? And it was tough. It was really, I think I spent several months just trying to figure out if there was more. But I do believe they have tools to look into this and figure it out, and then just share it with the victims in any case.
Yeah, we do have pro bono financial investigators who can assist with financial investigations. But frankly, Jose's investigation was almost as good as anything I could get through public sources. And Jose was finding property on Facebook, right? Jose was like finding apartment buildings on Facebook. So in a criminal case, it's really the responsibility of the federal prosecutors, and every U.S. Attorney's Office has what's called the Financial Litigation Unit, and the Financial Litigation Unit is supposed to do the collections. And the important thing to know as survivors is that the federal government has enormous power to do collections. They can seize people's tax refunds. They can seize people's Social Security payments. They can seize people's pensions. They can seize people's IRAs. They can seize people's 401ks. They can touch things that I cannot reach as a civil attorney because all retirement accounts are protected, but they're not protected from the federal government and they're not protected from restitution. And so it's very important for advocates to go to the government after a restitution order is issued and say to the government, okay, what are you going to do to enforce this? What have you already done to enforce this? What steps are you planning to take to enforce this? Because all the information that Jose wanted, the government had. At the time of sentencing, every single criminal defendant who's facing the potential for restitution has to fill out a form that they file under penalty of perjury that lists all of their assets, all of their bank accounts, everything. The government can't produce that. That is a sealed document, but the government knows. And so they know where to look for the money. They know where to find the money. It's a matter of giving them sufficient motivation and making sure that they do look for the money and that they do bust through those accounts and actually collect the funds. We have a question. What if my trafficker was already arrested and incarcerated and the valuables were already liquidated? Can I now get restitution? So the answer is no, you can't get restitution, but it can be possible to get remission. So Jose, do you want to just talk about the restitution remission difference? Just to briefly touch on that.
I feel like, so the restitution is what you are entitled to initially. In the way that I was explained remission, it was a second chance to claim more money or claw back more money. And I do want to add that I believe all 4 survivors in this case have formally received restitution or remission. But I, from what I knew, this was just a clawback. It was a second chance for us to claim more money from the money that had already been seized by the government.
I think that's right, Jose. And so you have to act quickly. If you know, as Jose mentions, if you know that the assets have been forfeited, if you know that the jewelry has been taken and the bank account has been liquidated and that they found $30,000 under the mattress and the feds took that at the same time, if you know that the assets have been forfeited and you know that there's no restitution order, then it's really important to get a pro bono attorney right away in order to file this petition for remission. Because although there's not a formal statute of limitations, there's no formal limit on how long you can wait before you try and claw the assets back. I think informally, 5 years is about your window. And so you want to do it as quickly as you possibly can. There's another question about whether or not we can work on state cases. And what I'll say to that is we may be able to provide referrals for state cases, but our expertise is really federal law. It would be too difficult for us to master the law of 50 states, and I'm only barred in 2. So we really focus on federal cases and federal law, but we can try and find local experts in states if you have a state case that does need to be referred. Okay, other questions? What's the best way to find a good pro bono attorney?
Well, I mean, I think that there's many resources out there that I didn't even know about. One like the Human Trafficking Legal Center. I think really if you need a pro bono lawyer, it's important just to connect with any resources who would then connect you with someone in your area.
So I completely agree with Jose, but I do think like the Human Trafficking Legal Center isn't the only organization. As he said, we're not the only organization that can do this. There are legal services organizations in every single state, and almost all of them have pro bono programs. And similarly, there are wonderful service providers all over the United States who have federal funding to provide case management and social services and victim support for trafficking services, for trafficking survivors. I mean, Jose was never connected with any of those, right? Jose was never connected with a case manager or anyone who could have assisted him in getting counseling and getting all of the needs taken care of from the trauma that he described at the beginning of his presentation. And so any of those NGOs that are providing social services, many of them have an immigration lawyer on staff at a minimum. And most of those NGOs have pro bono programs as well. So the one thing I will say is Jose was fortunate in one sense. He was in Texas, he was in Boston, he was in places where the legal market is sufficiently robust to find pro bono lawyers. It is much harder for me to find pro bono lawyers in Idaho or Nebraska. I mean, I'll just be frank, that the law firm culture there does not have the same tradition of pro bono representation. So frequently what we will try to do if we end up with a case in Montana is we'll try and find pro bono representation at a big firm in New York or Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles or Chicago, and then we'll try and find pro bono local counsel to assist the pro bono lawyers in bringing the case locally in that jurisdiction.
Martina, can I ask a quick question for you?
Yeah, of course, please do.
Is that because of lack, would there be more pro bono lawyers who'd be wanting to take on these cases if there was more awareness and education on the need?
I do think so. And one really excellent initiative that has started in order to provide legal services to trafficking survivors who are not in major metropolitan centers is the National Survivor Law Network. And Sarah Byrne's name has come up in the chat. Tarsha talked about what a wonderful pro bono attorney Sarah Byrne is at Moore and Van Allen in North Carolina. She has worked together with a whole host of lawyers across the United States. Brent Woody, who is in Florida, who works mostly on vacatur and expungement. Jamie Beck, who is at Free to Thrive in California. So they have a national listserv. And when a trafficking survivor needs some support, they will put that case on the national listserv in order to find pro bono lawyers in smaller metropolitan areas who have volunteered to do these cases. So Jose, I mean, to be frank, like we've now trained 5,000 pro bono attorneys across the United States. And we try and place every case. It's not possible to place every single case. You're asking the law firms to take an enormous leap of faith to do these cases. I'll give you an example. There was a case that went to trial. It was a sex trafficking and forced labor case that went to trial in Boston. And the law firm that brought that case pro bono was Wilmer Hale, and they had 14 lawyers on that case. And so the law firms, when they take one of these enormous civil cases, the law firms are committing to spend millions of dollars in fees and expenses. So it's a heavy lift. And they have the ethical duty to handle these cases with the same level of zealous representation that they handle their paying cases. And so pro bono clients get the same level of care and are owed the same level of duty by pro bono law firms. So some of the cases we cannot place, but we try always. And what I have found is that people often need an army of lawyers. And so Jose has had multiple lawyers at multiple firms doing different things. Lawyers specialize, right? So I sometimes joke that people need an army of lawyers. So I put my email in the Q&A. So if people have specific questions about specific issues, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to bounce ideas off a board and see if there's anything that can be done if you have a particular case that you're concerned about. So Jose, in the civil sphere, you mentioned that the case was much different and the feeling was much different. Can you talk about what it is for a trafficking survivor to control the civil case? Did you feel like you had more say over that case? What made it easier for you?
I'm going to be completely honest with you. Like, we went in and I had been so well prepared by my civil attorneys that when we went in, I already knew what I was going to say. And so basically I was navigating the conversation and my attorney didn't really have to ask me questions because I was so prepared and I was so ready that I just went on and on and on and told every single piece that I knew I was going to have to share. And so that made it so much easier, but also the stress of having everyone looking at me, wondering if they believe me or they don't, are they judging me? It was quick. It was in and out. Like, I went in, I shared my testimony, and then we left shortly after. And it was that quick. And I remember the attorneys actually saying to me, they're like, Jose, you could have gone in there by yourself. Like, it was that easy. And so it just goes to show, like, having an attorney with you and really preparing you and setting you up for success is everything because it was successful. And so that meant the world. I did kind of want to touch on something on just kind of when survivors are trying to navigate through these cases and through this system, and because it's so hard, there's also another piece where I constantly felt like I was a burden, where I felt as though that if I called my attorney to ask what I thought they would think was a simple question, I felt like I would just be bothering them. And if I could give any advice to anyone that is pursuing a civil case or even in a criminal trial, call and ask as many questions that you need. I felt for a long time that I couldn't do that, and I wish I had taken advantage of that and I had just called whenever, when I needed. And if they do offer you services, I know that you might feel as though you do not need the services. Take the services, test it out, see what it's like. And I really feel as though it would be incredibly helpful and important for you to utilize the services that are available to you.
So another question came in about how case managers can help people get restitution. You didn't have a case manager, unfortunately, Jose. I mean, I think one thing case managers can say is exactly what Jose raised, which is the U.S. attorneys are not your lawyers. They're not your lawyers. They represent the federal government. They are not your lawyers. And so as soon as you get that straight, and as soon as you realize as a case manager that you need to pull in legal counsel for this survivor, I would just encourage case managers to be very aggressive and very assertive about helping survivors find lawyers, because the survivors may not know that they need lawyers, right? They probably don't know what a lawyer could possibly do. And Jose told this wonderful story when someone, Stacy Jonas at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, told him that she thought he should have a lawyer. And Jose, can you just tell that story? Because it's such a great story.
It's hilarious. So at this time, Stacy Jonas contacts me and she says, "Hi, Jose, I'm Stacy Jonas from Rio Grande Legal Aid. And I'm calling because I'm curious to know if you've ever thought about pursuing a civil suit against Gandhi." And I'm sitting on the phone and I'm like, "What's a civil suit?" And she said, I go, it sounds expensive. And she starts laughing and she explains to me what a civil suit is. And she said, "No, it would be hopefully pro bono." And I'm just like, "What's pro bono?" And it was just more proof that I had no idea what these terms meant and what they were trying to say to me. Sorry, I think someone was trying to call me. But I think that it just goes to show again how important it is to have someone explaining to you what all of this means, because I just felt like, okay, if I'm pursuing a civil suit, this is going to cost a lot of money. This is going to be so expensive, and not knowing that could have the opportunity to work with a pro bono lawyer, which I'm so happy that I was connected with and was able to do that, because I know attorneys are expensive, and there's no way that I would have been able to afford it on my own. So
The beauty, let me just say one quick thing just to wrap up, because we're almost out of time. The beauty of the civil trafficking statute is that the lawyers can get their fees. And so they don't always try, there always isn't always money to do so. And you always want to make sure that the survivor gets paid first. But it is possible to file for legal fees, and you can get legal fees that are paid by the defendant to the plaintiff's attorneys. The last thing I'll say is, Jose's civil case was basically a case on damages, because Gandhi's guilt for all the things that were alleged that he had done to Jose, his guilt was established. And so that entire trial, that civil trial, was really just about how much Jose was owed for the harm, in addition to the measly $25,000 in the restitution order. And to be frank, if Jose had had an attorney during the criminal case, which he didn't, and if that attorney had put in filings and briefing and expert reports for a restitution order, Jose's restitution order would have been potentially $1 million. And it would have been totally tax-free because restitution is tax-free. So I'll leave it at that. But the last thing I just want to say is, Jose, you are remarkable. You are incredible. And it is just a joy and an honor to work with you. Thank you.